This is Openwork, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Reilly, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Rapkin, co-founder of Collective.
Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent watches from Singer Reimagined, Arcanaut, Fears, Chapek, and others. To learn more and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
It's 2010, and you're ready to buy your first nice watch, so off you go to Tourneau, Bucherer, or Watches of Switzerland to check out every major brand's offerings. You spend time with the sales associate, you cross-shop the 3 watches you've narrowed it down to, you think about it, have a glass of champagne, and plunk down your credit card. And that begins the relationship with your AD. But, of course, that has changed a great deal in the last 15 years. Suddenly, the independently owned ADs have all been gobbled up by the big retail chains, and many of the most famous and, to some, most desirable watch manufacturers have pulled from those multi-brand boutiques and now offer their watches directly to you, the consumer, in a single brand setting.
So today on Openwork, we're going to explore the evolution of multi-channel retail in the watch world, the growth of single-brand boutiques, and the advent of online shopping. We're going to talk about how the purchase experience has changed, expectations on all sides have evolved, and what the future of watch retail could look like.
Let's start by looking at some of the biggest players in multi-brand boutiques today. Bucherer and Watches of Switzerland. You and I just spent some time in a Watches of Switzerland ourselves in Las Vegas. Side note, if you have the opportunity to go to the Sphere, you should totally go to the Sphere. We'll talk about that probably never again, but awesome.
That might be our first and only cultural recommendation on this podcast. It only took 15 episodes, but it was that good. Check out the Sphere if you've never been.
Yeah, and what section was worth sitting in?
You want to be in the 300s, basically right in the middle of the venue, so you have the full experience of the immersive screen. So sections 305 to 307.
All right, there you go.
Very specific.
Don't say we never did nothing for you.
But hey, back to Watches of Switzerland. And actually, Asher, I have a question before we talk about that, which is, you mentioned the glass of champagne coming out before plunking down the credit card. Is that the correct order of operations?
I don't know, man. I've never worked in one of these places.
Okay. Have you ever gotten a glass of champagne when purchasing a watch?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Because I actually never have. And this is one of those things, like, for years, I don't know, for 15 plus years now, I've been holding out hope that one day I will buy a watch and someone will offer me the famed glass of champagne. And I have yet to receive it. But I'm not going to hold that against anyone.
That is actually not true. That is not true.
It's not true.
We are buying many, many, many watches from our next collaborator, and they brought a fabulous bottle of champagne in at Watches and Wonders when they showed it to us.
That is true. But I mean, like, at a retail store. Although, it happened once. You were with me, actually. I bought my Rolex GMT Master from a retailer, and they didn't break out champagne, but they
give you some apple juice.
No, some incredible cognac.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you know what? You're absolutely right. I do remember that.
So it wasn't champagne, but I guess cognac even better. It was I'm not a cognac or brandy expert.
It was pretty good though.
But it was like Louis XIV, the absolute pinnacle of. And someone out there is like cringing because I got the wrong number of the monarch. But in any event, I remember now. Actually, it wasn't champagne, but thinking to myself, 1, finally this has happened, and 2, this is a lot cooler than champagne, and it was absolutely delicious, and the watch is still great. I'm wearing it today.
All right, so there you go. It's a little freewheeling here in the Collective offices in July of 2024, but back on topic.
So Watches of Switzerland, Las Vegas, we went there. Look, it's a cool experience, and I think we talked about on the last podcast with Tony Trena, the notion that there's just more inventory at retailers now, right? And so when you go to any retailer, but particularly a multi-brand retailer who sometimes in the past have been particularly starved of inventory, because oftentimes if there was any inventory, it would go to the brand owned and operated or the mono brand boutique. So going to that Watches of Switzerland was cool because they pretty much had everything. Like we saw some cool stuff and some really unusual stuff. I remember, so obviously they had a lot of great stuff from IWC. They had a lot of great stuff from Moser. They had a really great Chopard case. But one of the coolest things going to that location was seeing 3 cases of Jacob & Co. watches. I I don't know that I've seen a Jacob & Co. watch in the metal in person before. It was at that same boutique, but I had never seen that many Jacob & Co. watches in one place at the same time. And that was just cool.
By the way, as a side note, I do get asked sometimes when we talk about a brand that we don't carry and then we talk about them positively, like, no, we are not about to pick up Jacob & Co., just to be clear. But I think what Gabe is pointing out, and this is a core benefit from a consumer standpoint, and we'll talk about the business one in a moment, but from a consumer standpoint, multi-brand boutiques. I mean, the idea of being able to go into one place and be able to essentially cross-shop and compare brand A, brand B, and brand C is a very powerful consumer tool. And it's a consumer tool that the industry likes and doesn't like. There are many, many conversations that retailers have with brands when they do own a multi-brand boutique about everything from location within the store to total frontage, and sometimes are even prohibited from carrying brand A if brand B says so, and brand B is a big enough or heavy enough gorilla to insist that of the retailer. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I mean, from a candid standpoint, part of it is that some of those brands don't want to be cross-shopped. We'll talk about that later on, but the experience for the consumer, I think, does have that, that idea of being able to say, I want to go in and I've been wanting to see this watch from Tudor and that watch from, Girard-Perregaux and this watch from Jacob & Co. or whatever, and be able to actually say, all right, at this price point, what does $5,000 get me, $15,000 get me, $25,000 get me? And let's not pretend that we don't know otherwise. I mean, the reality of starting a relationship with an authorized dealer who carries multiple brands means that your purchase history at that dealer essentially counts towards your ability to get other watches that are in short demand. And if I hear blood pressure rising when I say that, I want to get a little bit deeper into that because I think it's important to understand. I think we all intrinsically get this, but it's important to call it out, right? If a retailer like Watches of Switzerland in Las Vegas, let's say, gets 5 Aquanauts in steel a year, and you have been going to them for 10 years every time you go to Vegas and you pick up a Tudor and you pick up a Rolex and you pick up a Hublot or whatever, then they're going to be more likely to allocate that watch to you, which is going to be a lot harder if you just go to, say, a Patek salon in London or Geneva and say, I'd like to get on the list for a 5167A. The simple, and we'll talk about monobrand boutiques in depth in a moment, but like the simple math would suggest that you're just not going to get it. So there's a clear consumer benefit. And there's also the other thing. And I mean, look, this comes also from just owning a retail space and looking at it in a different way now than I did just as a pure consumer. Some of these spaces are really beautiful. And I really actually want to tip my hat to Watches of Switzerland in particular for their Soho boutique in New York, which is notable for two things. One, I mean, it's just objectively a very beautiful space. But the thing that's most remarkable about it is that not only is it a really cool space, it is the only space that I have ever seen of a retailer selling Patek Philippe in a setting that is not necessarily on the brand guidelines for Patek Philippe. There is a giant, beautiful exposed brick wall at the back of that store, which gives it that just awesome Soho New York vibe. Like it feels like it's its own space, not just like, a hermetically sealed Patek salon that was inserted, which is the way a lot of those, Patek salons can sometimes feel. So it's very clear that Watches of Switzerland in particular has put a lot of thought of late into what a unique experience feels like at all of their boutiques as opposed to a homogenized experience. And that I find really fascinating because it's a pretty significant departure from the way watch brands tend to think about the retail experience, which is wanting to have consistency across their points of sale. Whereas the Watch of Switzerland in Vegas feels very Vegas-y. And the one in Soho felt very New York-y.
What works about that Watches of Switzerland, and I went in there, to be totally honest, when Asher and I go travel anywhere, whether it's, going to Las Vegas in this instance or really anywhere, we go to as many watch retailers as we possibly can, just to get a sense of what's out there, what the experience is like, and what they're doing well, because there's a lot that we can learn, what they're not doing well, because there's a lot we can learn there, and just get a sense of like what they're carrying in terms of inventory. And I went into the Watches of Switzerland at the Wynn in Las Vegas, knowing we would be talking about this topic today. And so it automatically sort of changed the way that I evaluated the space. It just created this level of awareness. And It's an extremely impressive space. So if you haven't been to the Wynn in Vegas, it's a really impressive casino architecturally in terms of the design of it. And there's a lot of really high-end shopping in there and a lot of beautiful art in the hotel. And Watches of Switzerland fits into that vibe. When you go into the boutique, it feels like it's an extension of the Wynn. So the back of the store, you can look through to the back of the store where there are big windows that are open to sort of this lake and sort of waterfall structure out back. So it feels like it's part of the overall space. The architecture is consistent with the overall space. Now, in that same hotel, there are also monobrand boutiques. There's a Rolex monobrand boutique. There's an Omega and a Breitling. And those stores don't feel like they're in the Wynn. They feel like you could be at any mall or high-end shopping center anywhere because those stores are sort of carbon copies of sort of like the brand guidelines. And they just don't, it doesn't feel, you don't have the same level of excitement and curiosity of being surrounded in this beautiful world of design and art and then entering a space that feels like a natural extension of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and we're going to extensively talk about monobrand boutiques in a few minutes, but you know, there is something that has happened in the 2010s. And we're really going to be looking, I think, at the transition from 2010 to 2020, because a lot changed in watch retail in that period of time. And one of the things that changed, and Tony pointed this out in the last episode, is not only have some of the big brands gotten bigger, but some of the big box retail, so to speak, for watches has also gotten significantly bigger. Watches of Switzerland in particular has done two things. They have bought up several independent multi-brand boutiques all across the United States as they made a pretty aggressive move into this territory. Prior to, was it like 2017 or 2016? I don't think there was much of a Watches of Switzerland presence in the United States to speak of. So it's really actually quite remarkable how big that company has gotten in terms of market share here in the United States. And they did it not just through the opening of their own doors, but through acquisition.
They also did it through the opening of monobrand boutiques.
That was the other point.
So there are a number of them sort of hidden in plain sight. So when I mentioned those three other boutiques at the Wynn, those monobrand boutiques, I believe those three are also Watches of Switzerland.
They are
boutiques. Here in Los Angeles, there are two Grand Seiko boutiques, one in Beverly Hills, the other is up in the valley.
Topanga.
And that's owned and operated by
the Topanga one is.
Yes, yeah. That's owned and operated by Watches of Switzerland. So there are some people who think there's no Watches of Switzerland, for instance, in the LA market. Well, there is, but it's a Grand Seiko boutique. So it's very impressive how quickly they've expanded. Part of, we talked about their annual report. And I think, to be clear, like part of the reason Watches of Switzerland is growing in the United States is because of acquisition and expansion. So in other words, they're gaining share, even if the overall pie of the watch market in the United States is staying about the same or even shrinking. That's been their strategy for growth.
Yeah, but it's not all rosy. I mean, this is something that we've seen in the quarterly reports from Watches of Switzerland in particular. When you run a company that's that big with that much overhead, I mean, God only knows what they pay, in their corporate leases, let alone any spaces they may physically own. And I don't know. I mean, they may own some of this real estate.
I was thinking dollar signs when we were in that boutique in Vegas. So forget everything I just told you about how beautiful and elegant that space is and what that lease must cost. I mean, it's gobsmacking. The number of sales associates and security guards in the space.
This is what I'm getting at.
What the utilities must cost to keep that space cool when it's 120 degrees outside in Las Vegas and you've got a giant retail footprint with vaulted ceilings. I mean, the fixtures alone. I mean, the running those spaces is not cheap.
No, and I think this is the big lesson that as I was thinking about this, because you look at 2010 to 2020. And the significant acquisition, the ramp up. We haven't mentioned the fact that Watches of Switzerland acquired Analog Shift. I'm sure there are other acquisitions that they've flirted with or considered over time. It's not just the fundamental overhead that's the question to me. When I look at something like that, I think about what is sales velocity like there. Because if you have a store with, I'll guess, 20 full-time employees, contract security, plus the overhead of running it, let alone the inventory, makes sense why a company like Watches of Switzerland would have a net operating margin of 13%. And when you think about that, and by the way, I'm not making that number up. That was, I believe, two, maybe one quarterly earnings ago is when they shared that.
Yeah.
And what that says to me is that in order for that to be a truly successful business, the sales volume has to be very, very high. But because the net operating margin is so relatively low, it means that everything in there has to sell essentially at MSRP.
Right. So if you're thinking of going into Watches of Switzerland and asking for a discount, keep in mind that, on a good day, they're making 13% when they factor in all their costs. So the notion that they're going to give you 20 off or even 10 off or anything like that is probably far-fetched, and it explains why, they have a reputation in particular of not discounting.
Right. And by the way, like that's, I don't, that's not a dig on them. Price, like protecting the value of timepieces is a positive thing, especially for anybody who
it's a business who has an obligation to make money, and they have shareholders.
But the reason why I bring that up just fundamentally is that sales velocity, right? Which is that expectation that the things that they have on hand can't be very old. They have to sell quickly, and they have to sell through in order for them to bring in new inventory, in order for them to be able to not just be profitable, but to keep their head above that relatively tight line on that side. And that to me is this interesting push and pull that I'm looking at with big box retail in general. I don't know if big box is the right term. Let's call it big watch retail.
Big box for what? Yeah, sure. I like that. Big watch retail. All right.
There's a clear consumer benefit. And we're going to, by the way, for those who participated in our survey, we're going to do we're still cutting the data, but I have pulled some anecdotes from some of that data to share here. And one of the things that's very clear from the data is that clients really like multi-brand boutiques for all the reasons that we just described, whether it's relationship building, cross shopping, being able to go hands-on with a watch if you don't live in a territory where those watches are sold, et cetera. Like, there's a lot of consumer benefit to multi-brand boutiques. The flip side of that is the expectation being put on the consumer right now in order to keep those sharks swimming and alive is that when you walk into one of those boutiques, they really do need to try and convert you pretty quickly, because every opportunity of a client walking in, that might be why you might feel sometimes when you walk in.
There's certainly a heightened pressure. I feel like the pressure to buy, the pressure coming from the sales associates is more intense the larger the company is. Which,
again, makes sense. And I understand why a consumer doesn't like that. Like, I don't like that. I hate buying cars for this exact reason. But, and that's not a dissimilar model where the margins are very, very slim and
all of those cars sitting on the lot are financed, and the debt on those needs to be serviced, and things need to move.
There you go. So, I have a lot of empathy for that, but I also walk in there as like, consumer Asher, not business owner Asher. And I can feel it very quickly of like, it would be great if you bought something, because we really need that to happen for this to move on. And I think, as we suggested earlier, like there is this other major channel that we have seen grow also quite significantly in that period of 2010 to 2020, which is the mono brand boutique. And of course, this is not a new thing. Gabe and I were just talking before this, we're like, well, what's the first like real mono brand boutique that you can remember? And for me, it was Swatch Watch.
Yeah.
Like in many ways.
But it's new. It's relatively new to watches.
Yeah.
Considering the overall luxury and sort of fashion industry, where mono-brand boutiques were innovated a long time ago. And like so many other things, the watch industry was really late to glom onto it in a significant way.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about when you make the comparison with fashion is that in fashion, mono-brand boutiques almost do make more sense when you're talking about a brand like, say, Louis Vuitton or Gucci or Chanel, because those brands have many product families.
You can outfit the consumer.
Right. So you could say like, I'm going to go to Chanel and I can, and the client can walk out with, multiple pieces of clothing, some jewelry, a watch. Like it really is like a world unto itself. We see some brands try this, like Lord knows, Patek tries to sell you their cufflinks and Omega would love it if you bought one of those like little leather bracelet things. Whatever, but like it's in the grand. You never seen the little leather bracelets at Omega?
Leather bracelet things? What?
Yeah. They sell little like braided leather bracelets.
Oh, like fashion bracelets.
Yeah.
And doesn't Tag Heuer sell sunglasses now? They have a line. Yeah, they have a line. They're kind of cool, actually.
But I mean, honestly, like this also probably speaks to a larger strategy of wanting to provide broader value in the context of that product family. And we, the most notable transitions I think that we've seen, and we'll talk about these in depth in a moment, probably A. Lange & Söhne and Audemars Piguet going, in fact, pulling out of multi-brand boutiques and making their own spaces. So I think the first thing I want to do here is let's just talk for a moment about like why brands do this, because I think there's this overriding presumption that that it's a cash grab, and that to have a boutique, it's like, well, why would I, only take a percentage of the total RRP or MSRP or whatever of a watch when I could have all of it, hypothetically, by selling directly to a consumer. And I would be deeply naive if I thought that wasn't part of it. But I also think it's deeply unfair to think that that's all of it.
Well, I think that is a big part of it. In fact, that we're probably the overriding part of it, but there are real benefits to the customer as well. But that is a big part of it. In other words, taking more of the margin or the entirety of the margin if everything goes right. And opening a mono-brand boutique is not without risks. So we spoke with Mike Margolis about this. He was the U.S. president of Girard-Perregaux and the U.S. sales director for Hublot when both brands opened boutiques on Madison Avenue. And the bottom line there, as you guys may remember, is he basically said neither of those boutiques were profitable. Real estate on Madison Avenue, the build out on Madison Avenue, the furnishings, the insurance, all of that. We talked about all the costs that go into it. The cost that went into those boutiques was astronomical, so astronomical that it was impossible for the brands to make money on those spaces. Now, that's not to say every brand has those problems, but they were a calculated investment that those brands decided to make in terms of marketing and image.
Yeah. And that, I think, there's the other part of the quote that Mike gave us, which I think is the real insight there, where he went to Jean-Claude Biver, who at the time was the president of Hublot, and said, why would I, do this? This is crazy. We're going to lose all this money. And JCB apparently said to him, well, how much would a billboard cost on 61st and Madison? Margolis's response was, well, you can't buy one. There aren't any there. And if there was, it would probably be at least $50,000. And JCB's response to this was, exactly. So this is a billboard that we can put on Madison Avenue that you can walk inside and handle product.
Right. And sell some product and recoup some of the cost.
Right. But I do think if we zoom out there's a showroom quality to it, and this idea of like a completely controlled brand environment that's positive. So let's split something here.
Was it one last point on this? Because I think one important distinction here is some of these mono-brand boutiques are owned and operated by these companies, Swatch Group, Richemont, etc.
That's where I was going.
The others many of them are owned and operated by retailers. So we talked about Watches of Switzerland or Bucherer or Wempe. Like these retailers own. It may appear that you're going into, say, for instance, an Omega boutique, but Omega is not running the boutique. Now, the boutiques that the brands themselves decide to own and operate are almost always in like A markets so it's New York City, it's Beverly Hills, it's the design district in Miami. These are the most expensive addresses. And these are the locations where financially the stakes and the risks are the highest. So it would be easy to say it's really just cynical, but in some sense, these brands are taking on huge risk by moving into these spaces. They're not going where they can get the cheapest rent and the best rates on insurance and all that stuff. Quite the opposite. So just from a pure operation standpoint, these boutiques do represent major investments and major risks.
Yeah. And if you want an example of this, you can look at Citizen and Seiko in New York City. So Seiko took a very incremental approach. And, the Seiko boutique on Madison Avenue in New York 7-8 years ago was very small and
a hole in the wall.
It was.
But in a very charming way.
Super charming.
A hole in the wall.
And they jammed everything in there from, super baseline SKX style watches all the way up to Creedors. But they incrementally improved that. They moved it into a Grand Seiko boutique about 3 years ago, which was about twice the size. Still not very big, but definitely like a leveled up experience. Who, as a side note, by the way, just hat tip to our colleagues and competitors in that space. That is a fantastic boutique.
Yeah, and wonderful people who work there.
Totally. But if you click it up another level, when we go to New York
they're moving to a newer space.
Exactly. Yeah. So when we go to New York for Watch Time and Wind Up, I'm very excited to see that. But the photos say it is a much larger, truly grandiose space. Citizen Group just went from 0 to 100. and opened a massive, exceptionally beautiful boutique that's absolutely gorgeous. Looks like it must have cost an absolute fortune to build.
And it's a group boutique?
It's a group boutique. So like Frederic Constant is in there.
Oh, cool.
Citizen, it's where you can get like high-end The Citizens, et cetera. But anyway, the reason I bring all this up.
We got to go.
We do. The reason I bring all of this up is just to say, I don't know that Citizen Group expects a place like that to make them money. It's a huge brand play for them, in the same way that like the AP house is a brand play for AP. Because the idea is like if you had your mind set about what Citizen was or is, the idea here is by going into this playground of the brand, you might be open-minded enough to go in, handle something, meet with ideally and hopefully a very well-educated sales associate that really knows and cares about the brand inside and out and can help bring you into the fold. And then when you go back to wherever it is that you go back to, that you live, whether you buy something from them remotely or you buy it from your local, Frederic Constant retailer or whatever, you take a little bit of that experience with you. And, you really nailed it. If you want to think about the king of what I'm talking about as a model,
it's Nike Town
or Disney is what I was going to say.
Oh, yeah.
Same premise. Yeah. The thing is, though, and this is where I think we want to pivot. Like, we understand that from a marketing standpoint. I think everyone listening probably gets that, right? Like, you go into a brand boutique, you enter that world. That world is designed to bring you into the fray, make you excited about the watches, make you want to own them, own ideally more, several of them, and ultimately convert.
But you only get so many of those stores. Like these brands have open stores, and let's put the dealer operated monobrand boutiques to the side for a second. Some of these companies have opened so many company-owned and operated mono-brand boutiques that they don't get that pass you're talking about, right? Like, You get it in New York. You get it in London. You don't get it when you start moving into other markets like Chicago or Beverly Hills. Like, at a certain point, these stores need to make money.
Well, and when you say the stores need to make money, what we're also really talking about here is there's high expectations from the brand for the brand's value to increase because of the significant investment in this kind of retail forward marketing.
And it doesn't always work that way because you're putting all your eggs in one basket, right? So one of the advantages of like for us, we're a multi-brand retailer. Brands get hot at different points in time. Some brands cool down at different points in time. Mm-hmm. When you're running a mono brand boutique, all the pressure is on one brand to perform, and that's very risky.
The other thing about mono-brand boutiques is that, and we're going to pivot here a little bit into some of the stuff that we've heard from you guys on the survey, is that the expectation structure is challenging at best. So it's one thing, like we mentioned earlier, Swatch, right? Swatch is actually kind of an amazing idea for a mono-brand boutique because it is completely conceivable that somebody would buy 1, 10, 50, or 100 swatches.
The Swatch brand,
Swatch watch. It's totally conceivable. They're $100 each. They're, you collect them all. People do. Like Swatch, it makes sense. $100 is far from a heavy lift for the majority of people who are interested in watches. But that's not the same when you're talking about an Audemars Piguet or a Lange, or frankly, these days, an Omega. And I want to start by just saying, like, look, I share the following. These are verbatim quotes, but they represent something that we've heard a lot of. And what we generally hear is that customers don't like monobrand boutiques. I'm going to read you 3 quotes here from our survey. This is in regard to Lange. Number 1. I wanted an Odysseus, and the boutique experience was awful. I don't think I will ever even bother going secondary market to buy one now. The arrogance about me having to prove myself to be one of their clients. Another comment about Lange. It's a big fan buy, but I'm worried that the Richemont influence has taken too much of a hold. There's no motivation for me to purchase from a boutique as a buyer. I have to if I want to get their limited allocations, I guess. However, their limited allocation releases currently seem to trend towards the $250,000 mark and are made in units of 25 to 500. Here's one about AP. Got to be one of the worst customer experiences at any of their outlets worldwide. Not a single one in the European Union, North America, or Asia has anything close to good customer service. I'll be fair, I would try to balance this out normally with good positive customer reviews.
Can you read some positive quotes, please, about monobrand boutiques?
There were none. Now,
there weren't any.
Not a single one.
What was the question that we asked?
We asked people, this was what brands have you soured on and why?
And so the question wasn't even about boutiques, monobrand or anything, but monobrand unaided was called out.
Right. And the point was, the thing that has pissed me off about the brand is that they're monobrand.
Interesting.
And when you get deeper on it, I think it gets into a couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and just like pop the bubble on like, I can't get discounts, because I don't think that that's a reasonable complaint against a monobrand boutique, but it is something that we hear regularly. Like, I know that I can get brand X for less if I buy it here than I can at the boutique. You know what? Then do it. That's fine.
And I don't think those monobrand boutiques are built for people looking for the best price or discounts.
No,
they're trying to reach a broader, more casual audience.
100%. But, almost.
Maybe except in the cases of Long and AP, who you just mentioned, where there's an expectation of repeat
And this
buying.
is where things, I think, get a little confusing and a little hairy as it relates to monobrand boutiques, which is really the question of like, how much is enough for a brand, especially at those price points. So for example, and I'll preface this by saying, I have owned several Longas. I love the brand. The former president of Longa America, Rudy Chavez, is one of the best people in the watch business, full stop, in terms of integrity, kindness, open-heartedness. I've had good experiences with some sales reps at Longa boutiques. But the problem is that because the price of a Longa has gone up, I mean, let's be honest, like disproportionately to the market. Some references I think have gone up over 20% in the last 4 years. It's significant. And those watches, like the ones that they consider to be the most desirable, so like certain Longa ones, obviously the Odysseus in steel, anything in honey gold or a lumen, or even an 1815 chronograph, you must purchase, and I'm not making this up. This is leaked data during the pandemic. You must purchase six figures of Longa in order to be able to buy that stuff. And what's challenging about that should be obvious, right? I mean, most people, myself included, if they're going to consider buying a Longa, it's a Longa. It's not like I'm not going to be an exclusive Longa collector. And even if I wanted to, I don't know that I could personally afford to be, which begs two really intense questions that the monobrand boutique has provoked. Do these brands want clients that can only afford one watch? And is the expectation that money trumps enthusiasm and excitement? Now, I'm going to preface that by saying I think the idea of I wanted an Odysseus, but I couldn't get it, and it's the first watch I wanted from them, I don't think that's a reasonable complaint, because every major watch brand has a Halo product, and if you can't get that on your first pass, like that's not unreasonable. But the idea that you can't get an 1815 chrono or a Longa 1 if you haven't already bought a Saxonia Thin, for example, I find to be incredibly curious and a very heavy and onerous pressure to put on someone, because essentially what that's saying is that the business model of Longa is that they expect less than 5,000 people, they make 5,000 watches a year on average, less than 5,000 people to buy all 5,000 watches every single year, and that a significant portion of that less than 5,000 people should be the same people. If this sounds familiar, this is FP Journe. FP Journe makes 900 watches, largely sold to the same people over and over and over and over again. And the idea of being able to break into that because they are fully mono brand is very difficult.
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned Journe as an example, because this is a potential of where this heads.
And Journe, by the way, was another brand that pulled from retailers in the mid 2010s in order to create their own boutique network. And then that's where this, and I mean, look, here's the flip side of that coin. Journe's brand value skyrocketed when they did that. They went from a brand that you could get very regularly and easily and often at a break to what we all know over the last few years, and it's a whole other conversation about market manipulation or whatever, but like over the last few years became a rock star of a brand.
Sure, but here's the challenge that this creates long-term, a potential challenge. So we heard from our friends Eric Wind and Charlie Dunn at Wind Vintage that they don't like to take Journe on trades or consignment because the secondary market for Journe is tiny. It's a very difficult watch to sell secondhand. because I don't know why, but I trust them on the economics. Here's my theory. I'm going to postulate
I have a theory.
this.
So you tell me.
I'll tell you my theory. After a while, you build in an expectation in the watch community, like, oh, these watches just aren't for me. It's for a small group of people on the inside who collect them. Like, that's not for me. It's not. I can't get one. And you sort of write it. You sort of write it off intellectually. It just becomes so incestuous that you exclude the broader buyer pool.
See, I have a slightly different take on the same idea.
Go on.
Which is thanks. Which is essentially that I think the challenge, and I mean, Journe in their defense kind of tried to solve this by doing these like open house events where they like bring people who I guess are like Journe curious, into the boutique where they can look at watches and I suppose try to build a relationship to ultimately get to an allocation. But the problem there is that and this is true, I would argue about other sort of like super watch brands, Richard Mille in particular is one I'm thinking of right now, where it's, yeah, you're right. There's like this thing where it's like, oh, it's not for me. But there's another side of that's on the responsibility of the brand, which is if the brand, I mean, and this goes back to the earlier point about needing to have some degree of sales velocity over time. The brand does need a pipeline, especially now, right? As things have cooled a bit, there needs to be a pipeline. And for there to be a pipeline, people do need to believe that like Lloyd Christmas, right? Like you're saying there's a chance. And right now, most people are like, well, there's never a chance. And if there was a chance, I couldn't afford it anyway.
Yeah.
So
I think we're saying the same thing there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, and there's really kind of like two challenges that are built into that. One is around attitude. And one of the things that we've heard direct from our clients is that the attitude, and I mean, these are anecdotes, right? So let's take them with a grain of salt. But attitudinally, people don't feel welcome in some of these boutiques. So that's one problem. But then the second problem is also like, there's nothing to get. So if I went into a Lange boutique and I had imagined that there was a piece that I was going to stretch to buy or that I was willing to consolidate into buy or like whatever, which by the way is another benefit of monobrand boutique or multi-brand boutique, which is trade-ins.
Yeah. Great point.
So you basically have to go into these places with cash in hand, wire ready or whatever.
Yeah, a big part of our business. Look, we're not the only retailer for brands we carry. In some cases, with the brands we carry, you can buy them direct from the brands. Argonaut, Chapek are examples. Fears. There are plenty of others. One of the reasons people buy from us is because we do trades.
Right. And this goes, I think, back to the original point, which is there's a question of accessibility. So if attitude and accessibility, are both negative scores, that's a huge problem not just from a brand sales standpoint, but from a brand perception standpoint. So ironically, some of these mono-brand boutiques run the risk of doing the exact opposite of what they were supposed to do, which is to build community and create hype and interest around a brand. Instead, they create resentment, anger, and frustration.
I don't think that's universally true.
Of course, no, it's not universally true.
In some of the instances you're mentioning, I think particularly with, say, AP and Lange, those quotes you read.
I want to be really clear. I'm not saying it's universally true. I'm using these examples.
Yeah, but I think that we should also look at the flip side of it, which is we've also had some very positive experiences in particularly in boutiques that are brand owned and operated.
But these fit into that rubric. So like take a really good example. So if anyone here, I mean, I think it's pretty clear how much we love IWC, for example. IWC boutiques, whether we've been in the one in New York or in London or in Bal Harbor or like
Beverly Hills,
anywhere.
Miami, anywhere. They're all great.
Of course, Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
They are phenomenal. But part of that is because if we think about that rubric of like attitude and accessibility, both are there.
Yeah.
Both are there.
But the advantage, yes, you're right. They're welcoming, they're informed. It's not a high pressure sales environment, all that sort of stuff. But that is a benefit of these boutiques. Like I think of all the mono brand boutiques, one of the ones I like actually going into and enjoy is IWC. I feel way more comfortable in that boutique and in the Grand Seiko company owned and operated boutiques than I do going into your average multi-brand watch retailer.
Well, look, I mean, we can get into that.
But yes, accessibility and attitude are on their side.
100%.
For sure. So I want to ask, as we kind of wrap things up here, look, we're in a very particular moment right now in the watch industry and with retail. It's 2024. Actually, Swatch Group just released their earnings the other day, and I'm bummed they did that. I think it was like the day or the day after we released our episode on the state of the watch industry, because that would have been some good data to include as well. But I think we mentioned this in some of the data we used. the Swatch Group sales were down.
Yeah. Not only that, SJX, I think, pointed this out, and this was sent to me.
Asher's got a late breaking notification.
Exactly. That Swatch made 7.7 billion CHF of inventory, but they sell about 7 billion a year. So think about that. So they are making way too much stuff that's too expensive with no home for it.
They've oversupplied the
Correct.
market. Yeah.
And when we look at that in the context of a brand,
so what you're telling that's the value of what they made versus what they've sold. So they're holding inventory they've made that no one will take. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's the implication.
Okay.
Potentially. There was also a quote directly from the Swatch Group's most recent earnings report where they said that they see a lot of upside in the United States in particular, but that upside was going to be driven, and this is what they're saying, they weren't insinuating, by retailers purchasing. So in other words, their solution to the inventory oversupply is that retailers should just buy more stuff. Now, this is an interesting thing, right? Because again, let's go back to availability and attitude. What that suggests to me is that some of these Swatch boutiques, I mean, I don't think we're going to start seeing like, Snoopy's everywhere, but I just recently saw, for example, a Bond Seamaster available at a Swatch boutique.
They're available everywhere.
So they just
ADs have them.
Do they really now?
Yeah, out in the case.
So I think that tells you what you need to know about. That tells you what you need to know about availability, but they still have an attitudinal problem. And all you have to do is go on Reddit and search Omega Boutique, and you're going to hear a lot of horror stories about the way that they have treated their clients, and a lot of that has been about asking them to subsidize their business by paying for things in full that don't arrive for years, if they ever do. So when we go back to the mono-brand boutique thing, what I'm taking away from this conversation is two things. The positive side is that in a good scenario, when we're talking about like what we've seen from Grand Seiko, from Citizen Group, from certain Richemont boutiques, that there are good experiences that are out there that do bring you into this world if the expectations are reasonable, the attitude is welcoming and representative of the brand, and if the product is at least potentially accessible in a way that is palatable to a client.
So I want to look ahead now, if you'll permit me. Asher will permit me. So I want to look ahead now and ask a little bit of where we go from here. And this is why I was saying I'd like to lay the landscape of where we are in 2024, which you just did quite well. So what happens next? Part of what I'm hearing from you is there's an expectation from Swatch Group that retail, and probably third-party retail in particular, because we're talking about wholesaling into third parties, will help here and will come to the rescue. So this suggests to me that Swatch Group as an example, is more keenly interested in their multi-brand retail partners than they ever have been before. We talked in episode 1 about one of the trends of the last few years, and you said really it's a trend of the last 15 years, is this march towards mono-brand retail. The pendulum has been moving in that direction. Where do we go from here? Does the pendulum move back in the other direction? Do these brands become more reliant on third-party retail? Do they start closing some of these boutiques? Do they cease to grow them and open them? Like, how does the market find its footing, and what is the future as you see it now? Where are we going with multi versus mono brand retail?
I think two things will likely happen, or at least this is my crystal ball thing. Mono brand boutiques have a major value and place in the consumer landscape if they're part of the retail channel mix. And if you think about what I mean there, I'll use a guitar example, okay? So Gibson guitars, widely available at guitar centers and third-party mom-and-pop guitar shops all over the United States. If you go, however, I believe it's in Nashville, to their flagship store that is Gibson-owned and operated, that's a really cool kind of pilgrimage, because you know that what's going to be there is going to be unusual and special and distinct. There's merchandise there. It's a whole kind of thing that's a world around that brand. And that's a brand who a lot of people in the world are very passionate about, and probably does a lot to grow the brand, its perception, and its awareness. But it's part of the mix, and you can still go and buy a Gibson guitar wherever you choose to buy it. and even super limited Gibson releases, custom shop, Murphy Lab, whatever, all that stuff you can get from retailers. But they've created this sort of playground for the brand that is additive, but not constricting. So my hope for some of these watch brands is that they would think about that, which is, look, I'm gonna pick on AP here. Build those AP houses. That's a cool idea. Create culture around the brand, create a space where people who are deeply and obsessively passionate about the brand can come together. But locking people in to having to buy from an extremely constrained retail network, which essentially artificially constrains access. Well, not essentially, it literally constrains access and creates a poor customer experience, detracts from people wanting to be part of that club because it feels like a negative experience and it creates that negative attitudinal structure. So my hope would be that if AP or any other brand that's thinking this way goes down this path, it's like create your exclusive environments for your owners. That's actually a really cool idea, especially if those spaces are completely ensconced in the creative and visual articulation of that brand. Like, that's cool. But if that's the only way for a customer to be able to experience you, it creates these artificial constraints, which as the market continues to cool and then evolves into whatever it will evolve in, it doesn't necessarily help grow from a financial standpoint. And I think that's the problem. If the only reason I have to go to a boutique is because that's the only place I can get something, and then I have to jump through hoops to prove why I'm worthy of buying that thing, that is part of what has fed some of the negativity and resentment that has come home to roost.
The vibe session.
Yeah. So when you look at this and you're like, I'm angry and I don't know why. Like, there are good reasons why this has happened, and there are totally ways to fix it. But one of the things we're going to have to do is recognize that there is a retail mix that serves different types of people and the different ways they want to engage with brands, and respecting that while still creating these palaces to the articulation of your brand is probably a more circumspect strategy than just expecting people to do what you want them to do because you think it's a more controlled environment or more profitable or whatever.
So to editorialize a little bit,
I think I editorialized that pretty well.
I'm gonna editorialize on sort of behalf of Collective in our business, which is to say, you could certainly be listening to this program or this episode and saying to yourself, wow, these guys are really anti-mono brand boutique, and probably because they're a multi-brand retailer and it's a threat to them. And I want to be really clear. Look, we obviously gave plenty of instances where we think mono brand makes a ton of sense. Asher just mentioned them. We talked about mono brand boutique experiences we like, but selfishly from a business standpoint, having brands also retail watches, like having the brands we carry also retail watches, is actually a good thing because it means that they have a shared reality with us. So in the last episode with Tony Traina, you brought up, and Tony talked about as well, the example of Breguet. And I think they may have some company-owned and operated boutiques, but largely their business is selling to third-party retailers. That means that when they sell a watch to their retailer, they're done with it. They can move on. They're not in the market for that watch. They don't have to really face the reality for that watch. The brands who we carry who also retail watches have a shared reality with us, meaning if there's a particular watch that's tough to sell, they experience that as well. If there's a cyclical moment where their watches have fallen out of favor or aren't selling the way they have in the past, they experience that well. Conversely, if they're on a streak and on a roll, or there's a product that's a hit, they experience that as well. And what that means is we have a shared reality. So when we go to have conversations with them about which watches we're going to order, what the future of our business together is going to look like, watches that we're not interested in ordering or reordering because they may be difficult or challenging, they have a shared reality about that. And that's a really positive thing. I think sometimes we struggle with some of the brands who don't retail their own watches, who don't understand some of the challenges that happen on the showroom floor with selling those watches. So I do want to be clear, like, there is a very real and tangible benefit to our business of having the brands we carry also retail their watches and living in that shared reality that is important to us as well. So it's not like we want them to shut down their websites or their boutiques or anything like that. Quite the opposite.
And by the way, for those of you who are interested, I just want to first say thank you for participating in that Market Pulse survey that we shared last week, 2 weeks ago. And we are going to do a very comprehensive readout of that data to you guys once it's all processed and cut in the right way, so that we can give a pretty clear picture of what you guys think, not only about the industry today, but also what you think about the value of these boutiques, what you think about the value of ADs, what brands are exciting you and why, what's inspiring you to purchase or not, and go from there. So a big thank you for everyone who took the time to participate in that. And I'm really looking forward to having that data prepared so that you guys can get a good look at how you all feel.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for participating in that. And we can't wait to share and read out more. Hopefully from the quotes that Asher did share, you can tell that the results were quite thought provoking. So we look forward to sharing more. Asher, how about we leave it there?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. This is Openwork. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And please, if you'd like to get in touch with your thoughts, your questions, or suggestions, we always love those. Just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.